Are you concerned about the state of education? Professor and social commentator Dr. Scott Masson joins me to explore how we got here and what we should do about it. Welcome to Thinking Biblically. My name is Alan Gilman. Thinking Biblically is a podcast dedicated to exploring how all of Scripture speaks to all of life. Before I introduce this week's guest, I'd like to remind everyone to please subscribe, share, and like. This week, I'm very happy to have with us Dr. Scott Masson. Scott is an associate professor of English literature and head of the English department at Tyndale University in Toronto. His subjects include the literature of the Greco-Roman period, the Bible as literature, Shakespeare, Milton, 17th century literature, romantic literature, the works of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, science fiction, practical criticism, and classical and contemporary literary theory. Scott grew up in London, Ontario. After studying classical languages in Germany, he went on to receive a PhD in English literary studies from the University of Durham in the UK. His interests led him to pursue the restoration of classical education in Canada, including the founding of Westminster Classical Christian Academy in Toronto. As a tenured professor, former pastor, conference and campus speaker, and proud member of the Upper Mohawk Band in Canada, Scott has lectured and written on a wide variety of topics. Some of his lectures and talks can be found on his YouTube channel, and I'll provide the link to that in the description. Scott is the author of Romanticism, Hermeneutics, and the Crisis of the Human Sciences, available on Amazon. He is married and has 2 children. Scott, thanks for joining me today.
Well, thanks for having me, Alan. It's a pleasure to be on here.
So, member of the Upper Mohawk Band, would you mind taking a moment explaining what that's about?
Sure. My mother was, unbeknownst to her, adopted as a baby by her, what she thought were her parents, until they passed away, and at which point she found in her mother's effects some sort of note, I don't know what it was, that indicated that she'd been adopted. And she was surprised at this. Her parents hadn't told her. And I think her mother had indicated something of that sort to her, just not long before that, but it wasn't, it was just sort of mentioned. She stored it away in her memory, and suddenly, oh my goodness. And so she hired a detective, and the detective found out that she had in fact been adopted. And she asked the detective to find her mother, whom she did, and found out that her mother was Mohawk, and therefore that I am. So that I found that out when I was in my mid-20s.
What kind of impact did that have on your life?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it clearly from developmentally, not much. I was already, at that point, I was in Europe. I was in Germany by the time I found out. I think I might even have been close to leaving Germany. I might have been in the UK, somewhere in that range. I think I was probably in England at that point. And so I was already mature in by many standards. I mean, some would have disputed that, but certainly not at a stage where it would have caused me a real change. And it was my mother that was more affected by it, of course. And for me, it just raised the question of how my mother's experience related to the general experiences of Native peoples in Canada, and how many people would be given away for adoption or were taken away. My mother informed me from her relatives that I don't know if it was a great grandfather, but they were in the school in Brantford. 12 of them, it was a residential school, they were taken away, and all 12 of them ran away from the school. And I don't know, but I wonder whether that was a reason why my mother was given away. I don't know what that reason was, and it was never disclosed to her by her birth mother. So
it's amazing how we could grow up thinking that
you're one thing,
have
and then
one kind of history when actually the reality is some other kind of history. Yeah. And I don't want to, we could some of us that like to talk on Bible themes
Yeah, no,
we could
absolutely.
yeah, well, you know where I'm going with that.
I do.
We're
Yeah.
born into the world. We think many of us, if we're not raised with a an idea that God exists at all, we don't really understand what our origins are, let alone what our destiny can be.
Right.
And so, the little bit I read up on you, Scott, it seems that your your spiritual discovery too is something that happened later on.
Around the
Where,
same time, actually.
yeah, could you share a little bit about what that was about?
Yeah. So it was between my master's and my PhD in Durham, and I'm not sure exactly when I found out that I was therefore status Mohawk, but it was within that rough time range, and I think that I had become a Christian by that point. So I think that mattered more to me than this. Oh, okay, that's I have native blood. Okay, well that's interesting. But what do I do with that? And being so far away from home, I didn't do much with it aside from registering my surprise and think about it a bit. But yeah, of course it fits in with biblical themes and about having being in an adopted family, which all Christians are. So it didn't really throw me in that sense, but it did make me wonder a little bit about what that might mean. But as far as my own identity there as a Christian, yeah, between my master's and PhD in that summer, heard a conversation in a pub between a Christian and some atheist professors, and found myself on side of the Christian, who was arguing her case quite well, I thought, and she invited me to her church after that, and I had actually gone back to study English literature because I had found Christ in literature. And oddly enough, I didn't go to church to find out more about Jesus. I went to literature where I found him more profoundly testified to than I had in my United Church upbringing. So it sounds a little bit odd, but from my vantage point, it made sense at the time. I now think it's almost hilarious, but
Well, aren't you in good stead with another famous English professor?
oh,
Who?
C.S. Lewis,
Mm-hmm.
a little bit, yeah, yeah. In terms of the age range, I guess I'm in England, and where our paths diverge. I mean, diverge in many areas, but I wanted to be a medievalist. That's why I was in Germany before this. I had, at the conclusion of my undergrad studies, I had gone to U of T, Pontifical Institute of Medieval Studies, the Medieval Institute, and so forth, and asked them what I needed to do to be a medievalist. And they said, you need languages. You need German, you need French, you need Latin. And I thought, okay. So I went to Germany to work on my languages. And I did that for 3 years, and then left to go to England to be a medieval Renaissance type C.S. Lewis, if you will, follow in his footsteps. I hadn't read his Christian works, by the way. I read him as a literary theorist. So I'd read his work as a medieval scholar, and found that they didn't offer any of the courses that I thought I was going to go take. The medieval professor was on a sabbatical. Somebody else, I think, had a mat leave. Another person had a breakdown. I don't know. They didn't offer any of the courses I wanted to take. So I ended up being pushed into the Enlightenment Romantic period, which I didn't want to study. So anyway, but looking backwards, I guess God wanted me in that area.
Well, but how did you find Jesus in literature?
Well, the first thing I read as an undergrad was Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which is a story of one of the knights of the Round Table in King Arthur's court. It's a fantastical story. And he is the paragon of Christian virtue, or is supposed to be. And he faces this monstrous character who ends up being more chivalrous than Gawain himself. And he ends up failing in his quest to be the perfect Christian knight. And with it, the kingdom of King Arthur is undermined, really. That's one of the lessons of the Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. But I just found it fascinating, to the ideal there. And then we went and read Paradise Lost right after that. And I found that just compelling. I'd read Genesis, the the story, but I'd read it um, the way most people say they've read it. They zipped over it and took a few minutes to read it, and then said that they'd read it, but they hadn't really, digested the specifics of the details, which are really important. Milton's whole account in Paradise Lost, this grand epic, is really blowing up those first 3 chapters, and taking 12 books to do it. And I found it, as I say, absolutely compelling. And I was convinced that there was something there that I could not dismiss as just a story. I didn't think it was. In fact, I thought there was profound truth in it. And that motivated me in first year. I didn't do very well in first year, but it motivated me to push myself to understand what I did not understand. And all my studies pushed in that direction thereafter.
So what I find fascinating with this is you were exploring, the first book you mentioned referred to King Arthur. That's pure fiction.
Yep.
Paradise Lost is based on scripture, but much of the elaboration is made up in the author's mind. You said you found this compelling, but you're in a fictional world. How does fiction lead you to truth about God and life?
Well, I don't use the word fiction here only because the word fiction is popularly used to distinguish itself from fact. So fictional accounts are not true and factual accounts are true. The way I would see it is that I'm being given a story, a narrative account of certain things. And I don't think that narratives and the form of a narrative precludes something being true. In fact, I think that most of the things that we hold to be true are not presented in the empiricist paradigm of scientific research, where you can repeat the experiment in your own mind. Anything that's happened in previous history, you can't repeat that. And it comes to us in the form of stories often. And so I didn't see it as fictional. I mean, I'm not even going to deal with the question of whether King Arthur was a real figure. Some people think he is, actually, or a composite of various kings. Milton's account in Paradise Lost is a narrative poem based on the models of the epic that he inherited from his predecessors. And they, let's say Homer or Virgil, were presenting truths so important that they put it into poetry. And so that's, for us, we would say, well, they are putting it in a form. And when I say us, those of us who've been on this side of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, they put it in a form where it's no longer true, but it's a nice story. And they would see it the opposite way. We've put it in a memorable fashion so that it can be learned and known and recited verbatim. That's the way they put something that was so true. It was worthy of memory.
Right. And would I be right to say that reality is best presented in narrative form anyway, to help people grasp with the realities of life? We need narrative, not just a list of principles and this sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a place for both. Obviously, one does not need to forbid the other. And that's the thing that I'm taking exception to when we talk about fiction versus fact, is the idea that if you are presenting it in a fictional form or a story form or a poetic form, that you are thereby rendering it in the form where we're not really holding it to be credible or true or important. When historically speaking, and actually even in terms of mnemonics, that is, to memorize things, to commit them to memory, to make them comprehensible, we actually do want to put them in those forms. That's why we watch stories in movies and are compelled by good stories. It becomes instantly memorable. People will remember the scenes from their favorite films, and they'll even be able to recite the dialogue back and forth. If it's a good story, they do that, and they've committed it to memory because it was important to them. Does that mean that it's not true? No, there's something profoundly true to them about it, and that's why they have taken the time to memorize it. And even maybe they didn't even need to do that because it was so powerful and compelling that they instantly remembered the lines. And did you see the look on it? And the whole scene has been captured for them. So I really reject that idea that we can, boil things down to a point by point PowerPoint version of the truth. I don't think, and certainly that's not how Scripture presents it.
Do you think life itself is a story?
I think it can be understood as a story, but I'm a little hesitant on it only insofar as, again, in the language of many postmodernists, that they just mean that they're all competing stories, and there's no true story within the stories, and that I would strongly dispute. So
there is a true story.
Yes, and again, that was, you mentioned C.S. Lewis. That was the thing that convinced him and moved him from being a theist to a Christian, is the idea that Christianity was a true myth. He loved the old myths. He noted certain similarities between Christianity and those of Norse mythology or Greek or pagan, any sort of pagan mythology, all sorts of resemblances. I mean, if you have an attentive ear and know the literature, you will spot the resemblances. And he just thought this was a variation on it, and that was what was, presented to him as a hypothesis. What if Christianity is actually a true myth, and all the other myths are echoes of it, and to some degree debased echoes? They're missing something of the fullness that's here in this story, and the one thing that they're missing above all is that this one actually came true. The God man in these stories of the pagan authors actually did take on human flesh. He did walk the earth. He was crucified bodily. He was raised bodily. I mean, and this was very important to the authors to emphasize that in a way that's not true of narrative. It defies narrative conventions. They're really, really interested in the forensic details of the story to show that they were eyewitnesses of the account, and that's not true of narratives. When they go there, they've moved into, this is an eyewitness true account, almost as if it were written by somebody who wanted to put the evidence in front of us, and so that's compelling and interesting to me.
But Scott, and I know I'm challenging a literature professor here, but so you're on the witness stand, not necessarily you. A person's on the witness stand, and the attorney says, Mr. or Mrs. Smith, could you please tell us what happened the night of July 5th, 2021? And the person then tells the story of what happened. Mm-hmm. So much of the way we talk about life is through story. I asked you about your Indigenous background, and that's quite you just gave us little snippets of a very dramatic story that actually revealed to you your own personal origins, that you grew up believing something totally different, and then you came into connection with a whole other story. Your narrative, your narrative got changed by the truth. But we all enter in the world believing a particular story about ourselves, about life, and then hopefully we're being confronted by the truth, which is the true narrative of life. And then we have a choice before us. Are we going to live according to the true narrative, or do we prefer false narrative?
Well, that's a good point. And how would you know or be able to distinguish the true and the false narrative anyway? And what would be the standard or the criteria of truth there? That's
a big question.
Competing stories. Like how would you know that one was true, or by what standard would you consider this one to be true and this one to be false?
And the postmoderns say
it's whatever I want to believe.
Right.
You can't. That's right. And that's what I'm disputing. The idea that there isn't a true version of it, but there are competing versions, and there's just the one that I like to tell about myself, and I can change what that is in accordance with how I perceive myself, and I can express that, and you simply have to accept it as if it were true because I believe it so. And I don't know why that they impose that grid upon us, that you have to buy into whatever I say just because I say it. That seems to me an extraordinary conclusion. It does not follow from their own premises. So if everything goes, then why can't I disbelieve the person who gives me a new narrative for themselves? Why is that not open to me? I think we could get into a different conversation about
True.
that, but
But you had reason, like you had reason to believe that your mother's story of her investigation is a true story. It's not all made
I
up.
did. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And one of the reasons is because her mother had said something to her before she died. It was only hinted at, and then she found official records that suggested, I mean, a birth certificate and so forth, and she then had to find who this birth mother was and hired a private investigator, etc. And that seemed to me plausible, and it seemed to her plausible, despite the fact that she had grown up not knowing anything about this person in the past, and I, as her son, knew nothing about it. But and yet I accepted it as true. That's correct. Yeah,
Right. And for good reasons.
I
And there's
think
all
so.
sorts of things that contribute to making a deciding whether something is actually true or not. And of
Yep.
course, today we're being encouraged just to go by feelings,
Yeah.
which is a really bad,
Very bad.
very bad basis of and even and I think you may we can get into some of this. The pure sciences, the way life gets reduced to tiny little bits of things, don't really give us an understanding of the truth. Back to C.S. Lewis again. He says something about is it kissing? I think it is. If you think about how, maybe you know better than me. He has a line about analyzing a kiss. As soon as you begin to analyze the kiss, it's no longer a kiss. That there's a reality in that kind of experience that is true, that can't be reduced to scientific principles. Even though
Yeah.
you've got some of these scientists will talk about the neurons in your brain and the chemicals and what's being fired. But if you describe romance in those terms, it's not romance anymore.
No, you've taken all the romance out of
Yeah.
it. Yeah,
And
he makes the
romance
same.
is a real thing.
Is a real thing. Yeah, and testified to throughout every culture and in their greatest literature is as well, of course. And yeah, he makes the same point in The Silver Chair, where the son, there's a witch. I don't know if you recall
I
that, where
love
the
that
witch
book.
has trapped them under blow, and she's trying to convince them that the world that they've departed from to go underground is not real. That's not the real world. It's just a flaming ball of gas. And the spell is broken when, gosh, what's his name?
Yeah,
Uh,
Puddleglum.
Puddleglum
Puddleglum.
puts his
She
foot,
had
puts his foot in the
unleashed
fire.
this toxin into the air.
This toxin, which was in the air, that was putting them to sleep, soporific, and she was lulling
Yeah.
them into it. And that's not a real world, and so forth. And yes, and the experience of pain breaks the spell on him. And they note that even in their own world, it's not true that the sun is a flaming ball of gas. That does not. Although that statement is accurate, it is not comprehensive enough to account for what a sun is.
Yeah, so I haven't
So I
actually.
think
I love that book.
I do
It's
too.
one of my favorites. People out there, I still meet people who've never read the Narnia Chronicles at all. A lot of people get tripped up because they're children's books.
I read it only for as an adult for the
Yeah,
first time.
yeah, me too. I didn't know anything about them as a kid. But anyway, if you haven't read them, folks, you need to read those books. Read them. My recommendation: read them according to the publication date, not according to the way they're grouped in the box sets. But anyway, in that interchange where Puddleglum puts his webbed foot on the fire that allows him to think clear-headed, he says something that I'm troubled about. And what it is he basically says, like, I don't care if what I think is fantasy. I will prefer my fake world to your real world any day. And I'm a bit uncomfortable with that. C.S. Lewis, of course, seems to be making the case. And I think he says this sort of thing, that there's a sense in which the biblical view of life is so true, it's preferable, even if it's not true, sort of thing. So the risk of trusting it is lessened because it's still the best version of life possible, whether it's objectively true or not. One of my problems with that statement, and maybe I'm getting it wrong, is Paul says that if Jesus is not risen from the dead, we are the most pitied of people. that there is an objective truth that this is all about. It still has to be founded upon something that's objectively true and not
Yeah.
just some great grand idea. That's one of
Yeah.
my worries, like with Jordan Peterson in the route that he's going, that Christianity's just become this fantastic thought, and maybe it was given by God if he ever gets that sorted out. But it's not just because it's wonderful thought; it's because it actually is true. Do you follow me on that?
I do follow you, but I think you're misreading him there. I don't think Puddleglum is saying that he doesn't care if it's false because he prefers that subjective fantasy to the current reality. I think he's speaking with irony. She's saying
Okay.
that it's false, but he's saying, I'll take the falsehood rather than this.
Oh, so I take the falsehood, quote
Right.
unquote, kind of thing.
Correct. That I think he's speaking with irony there.
I'll have to find him and talk to him and ask him.
Yes, indeed. Well, that's how I read it immediately, because he's
Okay.
saying nonsense, nonsense, nonsense. And this is the real world. Well, I'll take that, false world any day over this. And so he's not saying I would rather be lost in the mire of subjectivism and my projection of what I would like the reality to be. He's saying rather the opposite. You are saying this, but I don't believe you. And he's willing to put it to the test by putting his foot in the fire. Right. So that's the key point there.
Okay. So what was it that got you? I don't think you explained that. So you said you found Jesus in literature, but was there an aha that went, there's something about this that is real?
Well, is there an aha moment? There are a lot of aha moments. One of them was that I don't think so. There isn't one. I don't think, because I can list them and I can't think of one immediately. So that's why I say that. I found the take or the presentation of Christianity in the academy, and I was there undergrad in the 1980s and 90s and so forth, was factually inaccurate, uncharitable in its reading, to put it mildly. But to be uncharitable, I think that vastly understates what I had seen there. I had seen, on the contrary, the evidence that Christianity had a profoundly humane effect for all of this just became more and more convincing to me after I became a Christian and looked at it in that way. And I thought, really, do you believe this? And you have to struggle with it then. When you see the effect of Christianity on cultures, in some ways affirmed by the ways in which we see the violation of Christian tenets as Christians, we talk about them. We are perfectly willing to admit that this is an atrocity committed by Christians, but we still call it atrocity. But again, by what standard is it an atrocity? If every culture oppresses those that oppose it, the people in power, why is it that, and it seems to me almost uniquely in a Christian culture, we accept that is a true and accurate representation of the past? Because I can tell you, in my reading of other cultures, the oppressed minorities don't get to express that opinion, and it's eradicated from their history. It's not preserved in their cultural memory. So the apostles themselves, if they are taken to be the either the writers or those for whom the gospel accounts were written to buttress the position of the early church leaders, then you could hardly have done a worse job than the gospel accounts give us, or that of the book of Acts, because really the leaders of the early church are presented as fatally flawed. Terrible. They commit the worst betrayals. They all deny him to a man, even the foremost amongst them, Peter, who's later called a pillar of the church. He is the rock on which the church is built. What an ironic statement. That is not the narrative that one presents of oneself if you are trying to bolster your own status. Look at our own country. Do you think that the prime minister of this country is trying to allow the media to present him warts and all, or is he trying to present himself as blameless, more or less, and morally, worthy of approbation and so forth? And is he trying to stifle dissent on that? The answer is we can see that, and that's the case in every country. They want good publicity. They don't want the bad publicity, right? So it's not saying anything particular about Trudeau even to say that he doesn't like the bad publicity. But if this is the document written by these individuals to promote their case, then why on earth would they present themselves so badly in it? And I found that Christians will do this of their own history. And again, why would they do such a thing? Well, out of a commitment to the truth. And I see that. And so the Enlightenment take on what the Christians did, I thought, it's, as I say, it's not just charitable, it's just mendacious. It's flatly wrong, and they're lying. And I found Lewis's, as a scholar, admirable in his recovery to some degree of the medieval mindset and how profoundly intellectual that era was, how committed to the truth and reasoning they were. The portrait of the Enlightenment is the Dark Ages, and people are believing in witchcraft and magic. And Lewis says, well, actually, magic doesn't really appear as a concern until the scientific era. And it actually seems to arise concurrent with it. And I thought that is extraordinary. Not before the Royal Society, but around the time of Macbeth, or in the middle of the Elizabethan period. This isn't the medieval period. This is the Renaissance. This is the cream of the crop as far as Western culture goes. That's when magic suddenly becomes of great interest. That's so again, and that's just one instance. You could talk about
right. We might be back
minorities,
there,
etc. You go on and on.
We're basically back there again.
We're back there again. Yes, how the church did in the residential schools, and we can go on. I can go on and on about the misrepresentations of that as well.
Right. There's one of the things that troubles me about the way the past is criticized today is there's no redemptive element to it whatsoever. It's just shame, 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 shame. But all the way through the Bible, not just the Gospels and Acts and so on, that whole Hebrew prophetic tradition that critiques human behavior, government, society, but with a call to goodness, to a call to repentance, to a call to restoration, to a call to know God, to a call to goodness is really wonderful, and we see it all the way through the Bible. And you seem to be saying that when we look at Christian literature, we see that same sort of redemptive critique of life. And there's something, and you use the word compelling earlier on. There's something compelling from, I guess, what we can call that stark honesty, that ability to look at things as they really are, to respond to them in the way that we should, to call people to build from what's gone wrong, and then to invite, and we see this more in the New Testament, then to invite everybody to be part of this great redemption project. There's nothing like it, as from what we can find. There's nothing like it in the world, nothing like it in history. Right.
So as literature, there's nothing like it. In terms of historical accounts, there's nothing like it. It's real to life. And the life to which it was most real was my own. So that was the second thing. I was convinced the Academy had given Christianity a very short shrift and a very unfair take, and that was not entirely a new thing, but it was growing more and more pronounced. There was an animus against the Christian history of our past, and it was being pushed more and more strongly and in directions that seem more and more absurd to me. But also the other thing that these stories then convinced me of was my own sin. And so the reality, it exposed the hypocrites, as Jesus calls the Pharisees, you hypocrites, you actors, you're the religious leaders. And I was very well aware of other people's hypocrisy. And it came to me that I too was a hypocrite, as far as blaming others for things that I myself was equally guilty of, maybe in a different way, whatever. But given the situation, would I have acted any differently in that situation? Well, not based on past form, no, because I have done lesser instances of that, because I've been a teenager and I'm in my early 20s. I haven't had opportunity yet, but watch out. We know where this is going. With opportunity, that's how it goes. And so that to me was, maybe that's the aha moment, is when those stories, which I think are true, realistic, accurate, then it says, okay, how about the application of those stories to you, Mr. Masson? And I thought, guilty as charged.
And that's a huge thing that's missing today with all this finger pointing and
Yep.
without pointing the finger back at us, that famous thing of when you point your finger at someone, there's three pointing back at you.
Right.
And
Yeah.
that is gone. That's gone from the media and from journalism. There's no self-reflection. There's just blame and shame.
Yeah.
So speaking of what's happening today, so what's gone wrong with education? Like what's happened to how our children have been educated over the past, I don't know how far you want to take it back. I don't know if there was a time when things were really, really good in terms of educating our children, but I know you're concerned about this. So what's gone wrong?
I'm very concerned about it, because I've seen, as a professional educator, the decline in education. I heard people talk about this when I was being educated. They talked about the decline as well. So when did that begin? Well, I don't know, maybe in the fall. But I do think there have been better forms of education in the past than we currently have. The paradigm for education that we currently have doesn't seem to me to hold much water, and it has departed from the classical model of education, which would have governed education from the ancient world all the way up until probably the 20th century, really. And it only slowly started to be replaced with a progressive paradigm. Famous figures like Horace Mann and John Dewey, pointing education towards the future rather than the recovery of the past, and living in a continuum with other human beings, benefiting from their narratives, benefiting from the study of human history, which is the venue for God's providence to be played out. We now don't look to history, historical precedent, historical example, historical figures, because we're really only interested in what's coming forward, and we're chiefly interested in ourselves. And this is one of the things that is the central focus of modern education is me and what I want and who I am and my self-identification. It seems to me like this whole gender identity project is almost an analogy for the educational path. Who are you going to become? That's what it really is all about. It's not, and so it's very, very narcissistic. And it's inculcating narcissism and a forgetfulness of the past, a willful forgetfulness of the past. Let's not look at what happened in the past, except with a few, I would say, highly selective instances where we can disparage those that went before us. But now let's look away from that and let's talk about how we're going to build for a better future. And they do this very quickly, with no study, with no criticism, with no, as you said, no charitable lens. There's no gracious, redemptive attempt to engage with our forebears as well. There's a loathing and a self-loathing. This was the third thing that convinced me as a Christian as well. I noticed that for all of their attempts to abandon religion, they then just pursued different forms of it, and a politics of guilt and pity and shame, which was true of all pagan religions as well. And therefore they'd be seeking scapegoats rather than accepting Christ's atonement for sin. They'd be looking for other people to bear sins, and these would be identity groups. So now we've gone back to tribalism, which I think denies one of the basic things and one of the great inheritance of Christianity, which is that each person bears the image of God, and each person therefore deserves to be treated with respect and deserves to be educated. And that is their inheritance. And that would have been our inheritance. We moved away from that. What a travesty. So I'm not against any group receiving a good education. I am against them being educated as a group and not as a person, which is a theological category. But I've noticed that this educational decline has been taking place over a long period of time. And I don't want to get caught up in the details here. That would be for another situation. But it seems to me that there's an urgent need to recover Christian education. It is an imperative recognized in the early church, and which would have marked, Judaism as well. It's in the Shema of Deuteronomy 6, Shema, O Israel, hear the Lord your God, the Lord your God is one. And what does it then say? You're to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Well, who said that was the greatest commandment? Who said that? Jesus. What was he quoting? He was quoting the Shema. Okay, whoa. And what does the Shema deal with? Yes, it is with loving God, but the context is of teaching your children. Okay, so why do we talk about the two great commandments and we're going to love God and we're going to love our neighbor, but then divorce it from education, which is what the Shema is? It's about teaching your children, and then all of the venues in which it presents that, in the frontlets between your eyes. So the way I take that, it's about your mind, it's on your wrist, so it's your actions, it's on your door frame, so it's your private sphere, your home, and then it's on the city gate, so it's the civic sphere. In other words, it's everything. But note that it's very specifically there. That's my take on it.
Yes, just so that people don't miss it. When you were talking about Deuteronomy 6, Deuteronomy 6, about hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. As you're saying, it goes on to love the Lord your God with thy heart. And then it says, and you shall teach these to your children.
Yes.
And you were talking about how it's a disaster to divorce the commandments of God from our obligation to pass it on to our children.
Obligation, it is what it is as well. That's the right word. Yeah.
And of course, in the Jewish tradition, it's the passing on of the stories of our history, of our God-given history, and all that entails, and that takes us back to the need to self-criticize and to learn and to repent and to build and to reconcile and all those things. It's not just about the learning of facts. That's why loving God, to love God,
lament and to rejoice. I mean, we have Psalms that express all of those emotions appropriate to those situations as well. We have all I talked about narrative as the primary form of biblical writing, but we also have other genres of literature as well. We have satire, we have wisdom literature, we have poetry, we have love poetry, we have epic, we have forms of tragedy. All manner of literary forms are embedded in scriptural, in the scriptures, and the composite of all of these books from different ages, different authors, entails there's a unity to them as well. And a very interesting hermeneutic way of reading it in connection with the central focus of Scripture, who's Jesus himself. But in terms of Christian education, yes, well, Christian education, where it does happen, in the 19th century.
Are we talking just about Christian education or education in general?
Well, I can talk about both, but I'll happily do that, because I think anything other than Christian education isn't education. I'm going to go out on a far limb there and say that because Christian education is the education in the truth, because Jesus himself is the truth. He points us to the truth. His story is our story. Our stories are wrapped up in his stories, whether we assent to it or not. Whether we do or not, we will glorify him, by the way, whether we're going to do so to our own damnation or whether we're going to do so to our own praise and adoption as children. That's our choice, but we will still glorify him in his reign and rule. And I think education became Christian. So the classical method of the pagan world was taken up by Christians and adopted and adapted and changed so that it became perfected. Look, the university is a medieval Christian institution. It did not exist in the ancient world. If you listen to our contemporaries, even Jordan Peterson, you would never know that the university only became what it is when Christians used it to explore the fascinating and, quite frankly, otherwise impenetrable connections between number and word, and the connections between the whether God is to be understood in terms of nominalism or realism. There's a debate in the early university. How is God to be understood? Is it understood just simply by words? and names, or do we have purchase on an ultimate reality behind that? Well, this is an important intellectual debate.
Which one is which? Nominalism, these two things you mentioned. Which
I
is
think
which?
realism myself. I don't think nominalism. I mean, I think there's something to be said on both sides, but I think when we use words, we are not just using narratives or our subjective takes on things, but there is a reality to which our words grasp hold of, so that our knowledge is, while not comprehensive, it is adequate and it is real. So when we call God our Father,
It's because it's
that's
real.
yes,
Yeah, yeah. Something I want to go
but
back.
there's a sense in which it is accommodationist language as well. But there is a sense still in which it is real.
Yeah, we're using language to try our best to represent that which actually exists.
And it does, though. It's not just that we're trying our best. It also does. There is a sense that is more real uh, when we call God our Father than it is even of our human fathers. Not that God denies that we have human fathers, but he says this is even more so.
So something I wanted to go back to was I do a lot of thinking about how did we get here, the state that we're in. There's things going on, government overreach, the
Yes.
whole postmodern thing.
Yes.
You could be whatever you want to be. Like, where are the actual roots of these things? And it seems to me, and I've heard different people attempt to talk about some of this, but it seems to me they don't want to go back far enough in the way that we've been influenced in how to think to see where we went wrong. And while you were talking about, when you're talking earlier about some of these early people that you think, like Thomas Mann, that influenced modern education,
Horace Mann.
Horace Mann, rather, I thought to myself, I wonder where the "what do you want to be when you grow up" came from. That we all had as kids, and that was always asked. And the way you were talking is like, wait a second. Like, I know in older times, not ancient times, just in older times, you weren't asked that question because you were probably going to do what your father was doing. You were probably going to continue his farm or his tailor shop. And there were exceptions, but it was not, certainly not encouraged to think up for yourself what you want to be and go pursue that. Right?
What a great question. It's a great question. And it's also an accurate observation. There would have been a time when this question was not asked, and it wouldn't have been thought to ask that question because it assumes that the question is a correct statement of how a child ought to see himself as well. And I've traced it back, and I think there's a good basis for holding this. I hold it in the late 18th century. And it's related to something that Jordan Peterson, you mentioned his name earlier, thinks is essential to our human identity, namely the idea of autonomy. He goes on and on and on about autonomy. It's being so important that we hold on to autonomy. My research, and I told you the story how I wanted to be medievalist Renaissance scholar. I ended up being pushed by God, now how I see it in retrospect, to be an Enlightenment romantics scholar, pushed me to exactly this point when I think things flip and go terribly wrong in a way that I think is important for our time. And it's exactly on this point that we think that autonomy is the essence of human nature. But autonomy is the law of the self. The auto just means yourself, and the nomos, there's the law of yourself. And the way that gets represented in literature, my area of specialism, is in the portrait of the heroes of the time. And from this period onward, late 18th century, early 19th century, the heroes are almost invariably orphans. They have no parents. An orphan is, now you'll know this in biblical understanding, but even throughout almost any culture, this is a pitiable state. You do not want to see yourself as an orphan, because to be compared to an orphan is to be compared to somebody in a pitiable state. I mean, so much so that in scripture it says that we need to look after the widows and orphans. They're in a difficult, terribly difficult situation. They cannot fend for themselves. And yet in literature, from this period onward, the heroes are invariably orphans. And I'll trot out some examples there. Look at all the Dickens novels. You can read the Brontes. You can read many of the Romantic authors where they are orphaned as well. You can move on through the 19th century. You can get into Canadian literature. Anne of Green Gables, who's a orphan. You can get into superheroes who are invariably orphans. You can go to Harry Potter or James Bond or you name it. Almost any pop cultural icon. Now they're pop culture, but this is again the culture of the literate. They are presented as orphans. Why would that be? Because you don't see it before this period. It suddenly becomes not just a new thing, but the dominant thing, repeated over and over and over. Who do you want to be when you grow up? What a question. Why do I ask that question? Because you're asking the child to think of themselves as somebody who's going to have to make of themselves what they may. And we're then going to celebrate that. Well, that is a new way of looking at things. And it's predicated on this ideal of autonomy and the idea that you are your own person. You're not your parents' child, you are yourself. Whereas Jesus Bar Joseph, he's the son of Joseph. And you're going to get a genealogy. Even Jesus, who's the son of God, is given an earthly human lineage. In Matthew 1 and in Luke 3, we're given two different genealogies, one which traces him to Abraham, the other all the way back to Adam. But in either case, even though he's God the Son, he is not presented as an individual, as a novum, as something that there's nothing like him ever. He has a human lineage. My goodness. And whose human lineage? Well, and one connects him to the great Abraham, our father, the man of faith, the other to our first human parent. And he's connected thereby to the human race. He's a representative of that. He isn't just Jesus. He is the foremost representative of the human race. His race is our race. He is a hero in that sense, a genuine hero. What happens to him is important for every one of us, even if we come from a non-Western culture, because it goes all the way back to Adam. That's the point of Luke 3. So this is extraordinary. But there you ask the question, where does education go wrong? Right there at that point. I could point to various writers, whatever, but there's a shift in how we see ourselves. Now, is autonomy the same thing as personhood? And I studied this and I think, no, absolutely not. It is not the same thing. A person is a theological category which we get from the discussions of the Trinity and the Church Fathers. There are three persons of the Trinity: the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. And by virtue of the fact that we are human and bear the image of God, Genesis 1, 26, 27, we also are persons, right? If we are in his image and he is a person, that means ipso facto that we are also persons. Now, the difference between Jesus and us is that we are made in Imago Dei, whereas Colossians 1:15 says that he is the Imago Dei. He's not in, he is. So there's a difference there. But so our identity then is found in him. And this is, for me, this is the fourth then thing, which was convincing to me, is that I found my identity more fully represented in Jesus and in a way that I would be proud of. Boy, would I wish that I were like that man. That is what I would aspire to be, rather than me. And you know what? He has adopted me and I am in that image. He's given me credit for that, even though I certainly have done nothing to measure up to that standard. Still, I've been by grace credited with that. And now I'm asked to live up to it and so forth.
Well, you're emphasizing, if I'm understanding correctly, this wonderful connectiveness that we actually have that's been lost. And now we're all these individuals. I think there's other conversation for legitimate autonomy and human responsibility, and who are we as individuals. But going back to Dr. Peterson, he says things like the individual is all there is, and I think he's really missing something with that, big time, because
he's a lost soul.
Well, you could talk to him directly, but
I would be happy to do that.
So there is this connectiveness that goes all the way to God through our families of origin, and we started with you coming to grips with your own family of origin, and there might be even more for you to explore there. What does that actually mean? And then for your children, in our own background, even I won't get too deep into it. In our Jewish background, there's so much diversity among Jewish people and how we relate to our background, but it's a thing. It's really there. It's something that we carry forward, whether we we care about it or not. It's the our connection to our people is so strong, and if we forget about it, then our enemies make us remember it, and it's all part of the grand narrative as revealed in the scriptures. So we're getting near the end of our time. I was hoping we're going to talk more, particularly about what parents can do in educating their children, but some of what you've brought up here, it sounds like the issue at hand is in our society, in our culture, is we become so fragmented. How, well, certainly the educating of our children can't be the only thing that we need to do. It's a big one, but there are some people that think in a book, something like Rod Dreher's book, The Benedict Option, that believers need to pull back from the society because there's no real hope for us within the society. I'm not convinced that's the way to go. Maybe, yeah, you're agreeing with me. So there's more to what we need to do than a better educational model. But can you take a couple minutes before we end? A word to parents. And if you don't really have enough time at this point to get into as much as it needs to be, that's fine. But is there a word you can give to parents in the middle of this, our individualistic disconnectedness that is one of the reasons why we're so lost? How can we help our children navigate this world today?
Well, I don't have time because it's such a big question.
Well, do you want to
spend too much time talking about me? I'm not nearly as interesting as this topic, but
well, we'll see how people comment. I found the whole thing fascinating. I think
okay.
It's your life, like all of our lives, reflects the reality of God and His story that He calls us into. Would you be willing to come back? Well, another time
of
we'll
course.
get into
we can do it.
the details.
And I'm happy to answer as well. I don't think I'll do it in a satisfactory way. But
could you how about whet our appetite?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, I don't buy Dreher's solution to the problem, and I'm not even sure he buys it either. But I respect him. I've read some of his work, and I think that he's on to something there as well. And he does speak to the civilizational darkness that we have now descended into. And I think he's correct in his judgment there. And he's been very strongly emphasizing something that I have intuited for a long time, again, back to my studies as an undergrad, where I came across Hannah Arendt, famous Jewish thinker, and her study in totalitarianism and so forth. And I noted many of the same things that she was talking about were true even of Canada in the 1980s, in the US and so forth. And there was another book by Bloom, The Closing of the American Mind. And he talked about the conditions and even the beliefs of modern undergraduates being very much like those of the Weimar Republic. They affirmed certain things, but they almost had no standards for anything, no standards of judgment, other than that they shouldn't judge. So it was all inclusive, it was all tolerant and so forth. And he said that these are exactly the same sorts of things that you would have noted in Weimar Germany. I noted the same thing. So this is a deep problem. I do think that Christian education is a necessity. I do think it begins in the home. The Shema we talked about, or Ephesians 6, verse 4, where children are told to bring, fathers are told to bring their children up in the paideia and nouthesia of the Lord. Paideia being the word for culture or education, so a very holistic sense of talking about God in every sphere. But they need to start doing it themselves. This is the problem. If you are given this responsibility as parents, and it is upon you, because it is upon you, you can delegate responsibility, but it's still on you. If somebody else does a bad job of educating your children, guess what? It's not on them. It's on you. As fathers, it's on you. So if you send your kid there to a school and they do something that you don't want and you're very troubled by this, guess what? It's not their fault. Or it is, but ultimately it's going to come back on you. You're going to be held accountable for that, because at the end of the day, the responsibility is given to children, to parents, and fathers in particular. And that is not revoked by your decision to give your children over to the public schools. So that, just think about that very resolutely then, and just think of the task that then confronts you as fathers, as parents. What are you going to have to do if you're sending your kids to the public schools and they're teaching them that things don't connect at all? You can do this subject area, this, but there's no connection of things. All things do not hold together in Christ. Christians believe that. They certainly don't hold that in our school system. They talk about different subject areas, and none of them have anything to do with one another whatsoever. And so people think that there are disconnected facts, and there is no coherence or meaning or purpose to our learning whatsoever. Well, this is appalling. You wonder why children have a sense of despair and why suicide among the young is so high. It's because they think there is no purpose and meaning in life. And where would they? Because they've never heard anything elsewhere, and to a different tune. Even in their churches, you just need to believe in Jesus. Give your life to Christ. Okay, I did that. There was an emotional appeal. I came forward. I believe that Jesus is my Lord and Savior. I said those words. I said it. I got baptized. Okay, well, what does that mean? I don't know. I have no idea. Well, you should. There's a logic and a coherence to it. How does that apply? If you can't explain that as parents to your children, then you are the problem. You are the problem here. And you can be the solution to your problem, however, by searching through the interconnectedness of things and the purpose and meaning, and how Jesus does say the things that Jesus says about himself, that in him all things hold together, or Paul says of Jesus there, is actually true. So I think parents really need to be educating themselves in their faith and not wasting their time on social media or watching television or doing whatever else they do. Now, if you find that that's too much to do because you work too hard, then maybe you should think about Christian education. And when I say Christian education, I don't mean Christian schools that use the public school curriculum and are taught sometimes by not even Christian teachers, but they're in a so-called Christian school. This isn't Christian education. This is a travesty. I mean, real Christian education of the sort that was sketched out by our conversation there. And there are schools like that opening up. And if there aren't one, then you, dads, moms, and your churches should get together and make them come about. It's too much for a small church to do. A coalition of churches with that shared commitment can do it and did do it historically. And we can recover that. But we have a big educational project, and it begins, however, with parents. Now, the problem for parents, they didn't get that education themselves. It's that much worse for your kids. It is within your grasp to change that, I think. And God willing, he will make that so. And I believe he can make it so, because the public system, let me say one last thing. Rod Dreher has a very doom and gloom portrait of the present, which is entirely accurate, but it is short-sighted, because the public system, which he sees as oppressive, is also crashing down in ruins all around us, bankrupt, embittered, full of chaos and rage, and offering no future to those in it, and nobody likes it. The pagan schools in the ancient world ended up closing down because people no longer wanted their kids to go to those schools because they were so bad. That's where our schools are headed right now. And so we have an opportunity as a society, as a culture, as a Christian community, to offer light in the midst of the darkness.
You know, the foundation you laid right at the beginning, Scott, just so important, by putting the burden back where it belongs, on the parents. And I wonder how many parents think that somehow, because of whatever happens in the school, that they don't bear that responsibility. But one illustration I like is even when we have other people teaching our children, whether it's an institution or tutors or a friend, we're like the general contractors of our families. The parents are the general contractors, and we might contract out certain things. We contract out healthcare, for example, though there's many things we should do by ourselves. We are fundamentally responsible for their education. We contract out certain things. But the general contractor, like if something goes wrong in the house and the plumbing's bad, the
Yeah.
general contractor can't say to the home buyer, homeowner, oh, it was the plumber's fault. He
No.
may have to go talk to the plumber, but the general contractor bears the brunt of that responsibility. So
Yeah.
parents, however you do this, God, it has given you that responsibility, and it's an honorable, holy responsibility that we have. Parenthood, when we've raised 10 kids, it's not an easy job, but no one said it was supposed to be easy. And
No.
but God, who's given us this job, will also give us what we need to be able to do it. And it's the same thing as you were saying, that many of us, I include myself, a lot of it was my fault. I did not get a good education growing up. I didn't care. My parents fully contracted that out. As many people know, I come from a very dysfunctional home. I had to learn all this stuff later on, but by God's grace, haven't got it perfect. I'm still learning, but we can. What a wonderful gift God's given us, that we could learn things, even when we're older. He's
Yeah.
given us the ability to learn, and in our day, we have so many resources we could go to. So there's no excuse. We
Yeah.
can access what we need. And all the advice you gave there was very, very helpful in getting together with other people and our churches, whatever it is, to do what we need to do to help our kids and our society in teaching our children well. And perhaps we can get together again soon. We can get into some more of those details.
Well, I would take delight in that. It's been
Yeah.
great, Alan.
Yeah. So Scott, thank you so much. Thank you. You said you don't often share about yourself, but I found it delightful, and really appreciate you opening your heart to me and to our viewers and listeners. So thank you so much for doing this. Before you go, if people want to get in touch with you, what should they do?
Well, I have a YouTube channel. I think you mentioned at the outset.
That'll go in the link will go in the
You'll
description.
put it up
to
there,
that.
whatever.
Yeah.
I teach at Tyndale, as you said, through my YouTube channel. I also have scottmasson.ca.
Yeah.
I also have a podcast called Paideia Today with a friend of mine, Bill Friesen.
So is everything on the Scott Mason website?
scottmasson.ca.
Did I say it wrong? I knew I was going to. I told you I was going to say it wrong.
You did tell me, actually. So I'm glad that you've done what you said you would do, and and send me an email through that. I think it goes through those sorts of portals, then gets you to my private email, and you can contact me that way.
Yeah. So say your website address again for everybody.
It's just scottmasson.ca.
Okay, and I'll put that also in the description.
Yeah, and I believe that has an email thing there. You can click on it and send me an email or whatever.
Excellent. Well, again, Scott, thank you so much for doing this with me today.
You're very welcome.
So you can contact Scott at his website. The description will be below, as well as so the link will be in the description below, as well as the link to his YouTube channel. And there is a lot there for you to check out. And so if you do have any questions for me, you could always contact me at comments@thinkingbiblically.org. Again, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. Until next time, this is Alan Gilman with Thinking Biblically.